Have you ever been called cold, uncaring, too detached? What if I told you that according to Carl Jung, one of the most influential psychologists in history, your so-called lack of caring might actually be a sign of psychological maturity? Today, we're diving deep into Jung's revolutionary perspective on what it means to not care and why this concept is especially relevant for women navigating a world that constantly demands their emotional labor. Let me start with a confession. For years, I exhausted myself trying to be everything to everyone. I'd lose sleep worrying about others' opinions, twist myself into knots to avoid disappointing people, and feel guilty whenever I prioritized my own needs. I'd say yes when I meant no. I'd apologize for things that weren't my fault. I'd carry the emotional weight of entire relationships on my shoulders, while my own needs went unmet. Sound familiar? Then I discovered Jung's work on individuation and the psychology of detachment, and everything changed. What I'd been taught was selfishness or coldness was actually something far more profound: the development of a differentiated ego and the journey towards psychological wholeness. Jung believed that true psychological health requires us to separate our sense of self from the collective expectations and projections of others. For women especially, this process often gets labeled as not caring, when really, it's about caring differently, more authentically, more sustainably. It's about refusing to be consumed by the needs and opinions of others while still maintaining genuine connection and compassion. Here's the thing that most people misunderstand. Jung wasn't advocating for narcissism or cruelty. He wasn't suggesting we become sociopaths who ignore the suffering of others. What he was describing was something much more nuanced: the ability to maintain your own psychological boundaries while engaging with the world, the capacity to care deeply without losing yourself in the process. Think about it this way: you can't pour from an empty cup, right? But we've been conditioned, especially as women, to keep pouring even when we're bone dry, even when we're damaging ourselves in the process. Society tells us that good women are selfless, that caring means sacrificing, that setting boundaries is somehow cruel or unloving. Jung saw through this lie. He understood that the person who cannot say no, who cannot detach, who cannot protect their own psychological space is actually not fully individuated. They're still trapped in what he called participation mystique, a state of psychological fusion with others, where your identity bleeds into theirs and theirs into yours. So when we talk about the psychology of not caring, we're really talking about reclaiming yourself. We're talking about the courage to disappoint people, to be misunderstood, to prioritize your own psychological health, even when others label it as selfish. Now let's get into what Jung actually said about this. In his essay, The Relations Between the Ego and the Unconscious, Jung introduces the concept of individuation, which is essentially the process of becoming who you truly are, separate from the collective identity that society tries to impose on you. For Jung, individuation wasn't just some abstract philosophical concept. It was a psychological necessity, a developmental imperative. He observed that people who failed to individuate, who remained psychologically fused with their families, their communities, their cultural expectations, inevitably suffered from neurosis, anxiety, and a profound sense of emptiness. And here's where it gets really interesting for women. Jung noticed that women in particular struggled with individuation because of the intense social pressure to remain in what he called the anima role, the eternal nurturer, the selfless caregiver, the emotional container for everyone else's feelings. Women were expected to live through others, to derive their identity from their relationships, to sacrifice their own psychological development for the sake of maintaining harmony. But Jung argued that this was psychologically catastrophic. A woman who never individuates, who never develops a strong ego separate from her roles as mother, wife, daughter, or friend, is not actually serving anyone well. She's living a half-life, and eventually, that repressed self will emerge in destructive ways: depression, rage, psychosomatic illness, or what Jung called possession by the unconscious. So what does not caring look like through a Jungian lens? It means withdrawing your psychic energy from the collective expectations. It means no longer allowing other people's opinions to define your worth. It means recognizing that you are not responsible for managing everyone else's emotions or fixing everyone else's problems. Let me give you a concrete example. Imagine your family expects you to host every holiday gathering. You've done it for years, even though it exhausts you, even though it takes away from your own rest and creative pursuits, even though you secretly resent it. The individuated response isn't to explode in anger or to keep suffering in silence. It's to calmly say, "I'm not hosting this year," and then to sit with the discomfort of their disappointment without trying to fix it or explain it away or apologize for it. That's not caring in the traditional sense. You're not prioritizing their comfort or happiness, but it is caring in a deeper, more Jungian sense. You're caring for your own psychological integrity. You're modeling what healthy boundaries look like. You're refusing to participate in a dysfunctional system that treats women as endlessly available emotional and domestic labor. Jung also talked about the concept of the persona, the mask we wear to navigate social situations. The persona is necessary, he said, but it becomes pathological when we identify with it completely, when we forget there's a real self underneath the mask. For many women, the persona of the nice girl or the good woman becomes a prison. They perform care and concern so consistently that they lose touch with their authentic feelings, their genuine desires, their actual limits. Not caring, then, is about removing that mask, at least in private, at least with yourself. It's about getting honest about what you actually feel versus what you think you should feel. It's about honoring your shadow, those parts of yourself that are selfish, angry, ambitious, or indifferent, because those parts are just as real and valid as the nurturing, compassionate parts. Let's talk about what Jung called the shadow, because this is where the psychology of not caring gets really transformative. The shadow is everything about yourself that you've repressed, denied, or hidden away because it doesn't fit with your conscious self-image or with what society deems acceptable. For women, the shadow often contains what we might call the unfeminine qualities: aggression, selfishness, ambition, sexual desire, indifference, coldness, anger. We're taught from childhood that good girls don't have these qualities, so we push them down into the unconscious, where they fester and grow. But here's Jung's radical insight. Whatever you deny in yourself doesn't disappear. It gains power in the darkness. It starts to control you from behind the scenes. That anger you never express, it becomes passive aggression or chronic illness. That ambition you suppress because it seems selfish, it becomes envy and resentment toward other women who succeed. That indifference you hide because you're supposed to care about everything, it becomes burnout and emotional numbness. Jung believed that psychological wholeness requires integrating the shadow, which means acknowledging and accepting those supposedly bad parts of yourself. And for women, this often means embracing the capacity to not care, to be selfish, to disappoint others, to prioritize yourself even when it makes you unpopular. I want to share something Jung wrote that absolutely changed my perspective. He said, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." Think about that. Not accepting others completely, not being accepted by others completely, but accepting yourself, including all the parts that don't fit the good woman narrative. When you accept your capacity for indifference, when you stop fighting against your natural self-interest, when you acknowledge that you genuinely don't care about something society says you should care about, something magical happens. You stop wasting enormous amounts of psychic energy on repression and pretense. That energy becomes available for your actual life, your actual growth, your actual purpose. Jung also introduced the concept of psychological types, and this is relevant here too. He identified introverts and extroverts, thinking types and feeling types, sensation types and intuitive types. Our culture tends to value certain types over others, especially for women. Feeling types are praised, thinking types are criticized as cold. Extroverted women who are socially engaged are rewarded. Introverted women who need solitude are seen as antisocial. But Jung insisted that all types are equally valid, equally necessary for psychological health. If you're naturally a thinking type, trying to force yourself to operate primarily from feeling is going to create massive internal conflict. If you're an introvert, pretending to be extroverted to meet social expectations will exhaust you. Part of not caring is honoring your actual psychological type rather than contorting yourself to fit an ideal that doesn't match your nature. There's also Jung's concept of the collective unconscious and the archetypes. We all carry these universal patterns in our psyche: the mother, the hero, the wise old man, the anima and animus. For women, the mother archetype often becomes a trap. We're expected to embody the eternal nurturer, the selfless caregiver, the unconditional lover. But Jung warned that identifying too completely with any single archetype leads to psychological rigidity and suffering. A psychologically healthy woman contains multitudes. She can mother, yes, but she can also be the warrior, the sage, the destroyer, the creator. She can care deeply and she can not care at all. She can be soft and she can be hard. The goal isn't to be one thing consistently, but to have access to the full range of human psychological possibilities, depending on what the situation requires and what her authentic self desires. Now let's get practical. How do you actually apply Jungian psychology to develop this capacity for healthy detachment? How do you learn to not care in a way that's psychologically mature rather than defensive or avoidant? Jung's primary method was what he called active imagination, a practice of engaging consciously with the unconscious mind. This isn't meditation exactly, and it's not just daydreaming. It's a deliberate conversation with the parts of yourself that you've repressed or ignored. You might journal, create art, or simply sit quietly and ask your shadow self what it needs to say. Try this exercise. Think about a situation where you're currently over-functioning, where you're caring too much, where you're managing everyone else's emotions at the cost of your own well-being. Now imagine the version of you who simply doesn't care about that situation. What does she look like? What does she say? What does she do instead? Don't judge her. Don't try to correct her. Just listen. This is active imagination. You're giving voice to the repressed part of your psyche that knows you're depleting yourself, that wants to protect you, that understands you have limits. Most women are terrified of this voice because we've been taught it's selfish or cruel. But Jung would say this voice is essential for your psychological survival. Another crucial practice is what Jung called withdrawing projections. We constantly project our own unconscious content onto other people. You might project your inner critic onto your mother, seeing her as judgmental even when she's not. You might project your own ambition onto a colleague, resenting her success because you won't acknowledge your own desires. You might project your need for approval onto everyone around you, imagining they're constantly evaluating you, when really, that's your own internal process. When you withdraw these projections, when you recognize that what you're seeing out there is actually something in here, you reclaim enormous psychological power. You stop caring so much about others' opinions because you realize you're really battling your own internalized voices. You stop trying to fix everyone else because you recognize you're trying to fix disowned parts of yourself. Jung also emphasized the importance of balancing the opposites within your psyche. Carl Jung used the term enantiodromia, which means that everything eventually turns into its opposite. If you're constantly caring, constantly giving, constantly available, you will eventually swing to the opposite extreme: complete burnout, bitter resentment, or cold withdrawal. The goal is to find what Jung called the transcendent function, the ability to hold both opposites simultaneously. You can care and not care. You can be connected and boundaried. You can be compassionate and self-protective. This isn't about finding some perfect middle ground. It's about developing the psychological flexibility to move between these poles consciously, rather than being possessed by one extreme or the other. Let me share a personal application of this. I used to feel tremendous guilt whenever I prioritized my work over social obligations. The good woman part of me said I should always be available, always say yes, always put relationships first. But my shadow knew that my work mattered, that my creative life was sacred, that I needed solitude to function. Instead of fighting between these two parts, I learned to honor both. Yes, relationships matter, and I care about the people in my life. And also, my work matters, and sometimes I will disappoint people to protect my creative time. Both are true, both are valid. I don't have to choose between being a caring person and being someone who has boundaries. This is Jungian individuation in action. It's not about becoming cold or indifferent. It's about becoming whole, which means integrating all the contradictory parts of yourself into a conscious, authentic identity. So where does this leave us? What does a truly individuated woman look like in practice? And how does this psychology of not caring actually manifest in daily life? First, understand that individuation is not a destination but a lifelong process. Jung himself said that individuation typically doesn't even begin in earnest until midlife, when the structures and roles we've built start to feel constraining, when the persona we've been wearing starts to suffocate us. This is often when women experience what looks like a crisis, but is actually an awakening. The individuated woman has developed what Jung called a strong ego. This doesn't mean she's arrogant or self-absorbed. It means she has a stable sense of self that isn't constantly buffeted by others' opinions, moods, or demands. She knows who she is. She knows what she values. She knows her limits. And she protects these truths even when doing so makes her unpopular. She's also made peace with her shadow. She knows she's capable of selfishness, anger, jealousy, and indifference, and she doesn't waste energy pretending otherwise. This doesn't mean she acts on every dark impulse, but she's not in denial about her full humanity. This acceptance actually makes her more ethical, not less, because she's making conscious choices rather than being controlled by repressed material. The individuated woman has learned to disappoint people without collapsing into guilt or shame. She can say no clearly and without over-explanation. She can watch someone be upset with her choices and not immediately try to fix their feelings or change her decision. She understands that other people's disappointment is not an emergency she needs to resolve. She's selective about where she invests her care and energy. This is crucial. Not caring doesn't mean caring about nothing. It means being intentional about what you care about, rather than scattering yourself across every request, every need, every expectation that comes your way. She understands that saying yes to everything means saying yes to nothing fully. She's also developed what Jung called the transcendent function, the ability to hold paradox. She can be vulnerable and boundaried. She can be ambitious and collaborative. She can love deeply and still maintain her autonomy. She doesn't collapse into either-or thinking, but can navigate the complex both-and reality of human existence. Let me be clear about what this is not. This is not about becoming a narcissist or sociopath. It's not about cruelty or callousness. It's not about cutting everyone out of your life and living in isolated self-sufficiency. Jung believed deeply in relationship, in community, in our interconnectedness. But he also believed that genuine relationship is only possible between two individuated people who know themselves and respect each other's sovereignty. The psychology of not caring is really about psychological sovereignty. It's about reclaiming authority over your own life, your own psyche, your own choices. It's about refusing to be colonized by other people's needs, expectations, or judgments. It's about remembering that you are not here to live someone else's unlived life or to fulfill someone else's idea of who you should be. For women specifically, this work is revolutionary because we've been trained for centuries to exist as satellites orbiting other people's suns, to derive our light and purpose from reflecting others' needs back to them. Individuation means becoming your own sun, your own center, your own source of meaning and direction. As you move through your life applying these principles, you'll notice something interesting. The people who truly love you, who respect you as a whole person, will actually appreciate your boundaries and your authenticity. The relationships that deepen are the ones where both people are individuated enough to relate without fusion or control. And the people who reject you for not caring in the ways they want, those losses, as painful as they might be, create space for relationships and experiences that actually align with who you authentically are. Jung believed that the second half of life is about subtraction as much as addition, about releasing what no longer serves your individuation process. So here's my challenge to you. Identify one area of your life where you're over-caring, where you're depleting yourself to meet others' expectations. Practice not caring about that thing. Notice the discomfort, the guilt, the fear that arises. Sit with it. This is your psyche reorganizing around a more authentic center. This is individuation happening in real time. And if you found this exploration valuable, subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into psychology, personal growth, and the wisdom of Carl Jung. Drop a comment sharing where you're learning to care less and live more authentically.